go. Whoops, I wanted to acknowledge the funding and support we receive from the Office on Violence Against Women. And so our topic today is using collateral interviews to enrich our fatality review work. And the things we're going to be talking about is we'll define what we mean by that and why we feel it's important to include collateral interviews as part of your process, how to prepare for the interviews, and also the background and context of interviewing, the different kinds of participants you will want to consider, including in your reviews, which would be the perpetrators of homicides, both men and women, survivors in cases of near death, family members, neighbors, friends, agency personnel, any people who might have information about the people involved in the homicide that could enrich your understanding of the case. We'll talk about how to frame recommendations and to bring the information back to the team. So when we're talking about collateral interviews here, we're not using it in the sense that you use it within the courtroom in terms of finding to interview people who are familiar with the victim and or the perpetrator, who can provide information that may be missing in the documentary evidence that you have for your review, so that you can understand more completely what their lives were like that preceded the homicide. We know that in many cases there hasn't been a lot of agency involvement, and so when we rely on documents only or criminal justice actors only, we're going to miss a lot of the background information on the lived experiences, both of the victim and of the perpetrator. We also feel like offering family members an opportunity to participate is very meaningful for them, and it also enriches our understanding. And there's always going to be different perspectives on the lives of the people involved, as well as the incident. So using collateral interviews will provide different perspectives that you might be missing by relying on documents. And this also allows family members and loved ones to contribute to the recommendations the team will develop as a result of the review. So when we come to a case for domestic violence fatality review, it's somewhat like the parable of the blind man exploring an elephant, in that we really don't know about the lives of the people involved, and our job is to try to gain an understanding of those lives. And our understanding is going to be dependent on the kind of evidence available to us. And so if you just look at the police reports on the perpetrator, for example, you might get one level of understanding of the homicide. But then if you interview the perpetrator's family, you may have an entirely different understanding of what led up to that tragedy. And so the importance of collateral interviews is expanding that base of evidence for you to put all the pieces together and have a more complete picture of the homicide. So if your team decides to conduct these interviews, and I should say too that generally these are for teams who are engaged in in-depth reviews rather than the kind of statistical data gathering that you might conduct at a more state level. These are for the in-depth review processes. If your team decides to go down this path, you want to first decide what it is you're trying to learn. What are the missing pieces? So you'll have to completely review the documents that are available to you and identify what information is public, what's private, and what's confidential. So certainly there are aspects of people's lives that are very important to understanding the antecedents to a homicide that are not going to be part of the public record and could be very delicate. And you want to know what aspects of the case are going to be in the public eye already and not confidential, and then what is private and confidential. Try to develop a list of the people who could be involved in creating this knowledge base. So know what the relationships are between those people. So for example, oftentimes there are relationships in the victim's family that are maybe antagonistic. There may be battles going on over custody between the perpetrator's family and the victim's family. Try to develop an understanding of what the relationships are. And then in selecting people to conduct the interviews, ensure that they're people with experience and knowledge on how to conduct those interviews. So most teams will have a victim advocate or a psychologist, people who are trained in conducting interviews on sensitive matters in an empathic manner. Those are good people to select. You don't want to have people who are not knowledgeable because they can potentially alienate or reveal information that is inappropriate to reveal. And know how you're going to document the interview. So, some people are reluctant to take notes while someone's sharing very personal, difficult information with them, but we have found that often people value and recognize that when someone's taking notes while they're talking, it means they really are interested and paying attention. We had parents of a victim come to our team, and they were quite taken by the fact that the sheriff was taking notes on what they said, and it was important to them. But in some situations, that's not possible, so know how you're going to record. You may have to take notes after following the interview. And you should rely on the existing relationships that team members have in order to arrange the contact. So if you have the police reports from the case, often there will be phone numbers for witnesses or people involved in the investigation. But you don't want cold calls from a team member that is unknown to those witnesses or individuals. It's best if you can rely on someone on the team. It can be a detective, it can be a victim advocate, somebody who has had a prior relationship with that person in order to establish the contact. And they may be able to arrange for other people to do the interview, but they should be the initial contactor if at all possible. So there's different ways that you can conduct collateral interviews. Certainly one option is to invite people to come and attend the team meeting. And some people are comfortable doing that. And in some teams, there'll be upwards of 30 people in the room, and that might be overwhelming for some people who would prefer just to have a one-on-one. Other people welcome that opportunity to address the entire team. So it's their choice, leave it up to them. If you do decide to invite people to come to a team meeting, make sure that the team is prepared. It's best if people submit questions ahead of time and ensure that it's an environment of respect. So you don't want people telling their own story of tragic loss while people are looking on Facebook or on their cell phones. So you want to ensure that environment supports the people who are sharing their story. Another option, if people aren't comfortable or able to attend a team meeting, is to appoint members of your team to conduct interviews at the convenience of people, either in their homes or at a public place, or if those aren't possible, by telephone in some cases. We have found that interviewing people in their homes actually provides some more insight into the family in many cases. You get a sense of what the living situation was or what was important to those people by the decorations in their home. We visited the home of a survivor who there was a lot of child sexual abuse occurring in the home, and the home was very lovely but very sparsely furnished, but there was a statue of the three monkeys that are hear no, see no, speak no evil prominently placed in the room, and the interviewers found that a really interesting visual representation of kind of the dynamics of the sexual abuse in that family. If you're going to interview perpetrators, they're usually, if they're alive, they're usually going to be incarcerated in prison, not in jail, because all your cases obviously are going to be concluded and so you would have to get access to people in prison. And then if none of those options are available, sometimes we can write to a person and get questions for the team, and then the person responds in writing. And sometimes this is necessary for perpetrators who are incarcerated in federal facilities in other states or are otherwise inaccessible. So before heading out to conduct the interviews, you want to make sure that you're very familiar with the case. So have reviewed all of the documents and spoken to people who worked the case, the detectives, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys involved, the victim advocates. So you know what kind of questions you want to ask. What are the gaps in your knowledge? And you may find that the record varies from what the interviewees will share with you, and that's perfectly fine, because the interviews are not truth-finding endeavors. They're endeavors to try to make sense and understand the situation. But it helps if you know, for example, if a perpetrator claims that it was an accident and you have full knowledge that the forensic evidence ensures that that's not the case, it's helpful to have that information in the back of your mind, even though you're not going to confront the person and say, no, that's not true. You're there to try to understand rather than judge and find the truth. And as you begin the interview too, people will assume that you have some knowledge, and so you want to be at least familiar enough with the details of the case that's true. So the legal issues, of course, you want to ensure that all the appellate issues have been concluded before you conduct any review, but certainly before you would attempt to conduct collateral interviews. If you are going to interview an incarcerated perpetrator, you make sure to explain that the interview has no relationship to their conditions of containment, or they're not going to be related to any kind of parole hearing or any privileges that might result. You should also inform them that you're a mandatory reporter, so any information about child abuse or other offenses that's discussed, that you would need to report that. And again, that you're not there to do a criminal investigation. And then also determine whether there are any civil issues which remain, such as child custody determinations, so that you don't step on on any toes there or uncover information that you don't really want to be involved in any of these civil hearings that are unrelated to the criminal case. So if you're going to interview people who are incarcerated in prison, obviously these are secure institutions, and it's very important that you contact someone who's sympathetic to the Fatality review, and it's best if you have someone on your team who has a relationship with the Department of Corrections, or at least would be recognized as a person in authority, such as a police officer or a prosecutor. And you begin by sending a letter to the perpetrator to let them know why you would want to interview them, and emphasize that you're attempting to help other families rather than determine any innocence or guilt. If you're not sure where the perpetrator is located, if they're in a state facility, all the states have inmate locator on their web pages. I've got California's up there. You can just type the person's name in, and it will tell you what facility they're located in. Before you visit a prison, make sure that you're aware of the rules. Some facilities prohibit denim, some colors are prohibited. Know what you're allowed to wear, what you're permitted to bring into the interview. Don't bring any jewelry or anything that would be call attention to yourself, or and always be aware that the prison's first priority is security. And so there may be occasions where you show up and there's a lockdown, you're not able to conduct the interview. So always have a plan B. If that's the case, you may have to use telephone or letters to conduct the interview. I'm going to turn the next portion over to Dr. Websdale.
Thank you, Dr. Ferraro, and good afternoon or good morning to folks, depending on where you are. I'd like to just start by saying that as Dr. Ferraro, I've done a number of prison interviews and other interviews over the years with perpetrators. And just to lay out a couple of sort of observations before I go into some of the PowerPoint bullet points. There are sort of several ways of doing these interviews. You can script these out in a structured way at the front end. In other words, the interview can sort of consist of questions that the team have already predetermined, have sort of worked out, and you can sort of work through the flow of those questions fairly systematically. You could have in your head, so we'll call that a structured interview. You could have in your head, more of a semi-structured or focused form of interview where you've got some bullet points either on a keywords card or something to that effect, so that you know the broad topics and where you're going, but where you don't sort of follow a more sort of rote structured set of questions. And then another style might be to have much more of a conversation, an open conversation about where you're going, starting with some rather innocuous questions, some introductory questions, followed by some perhaps more difficult questions later on in the interview. So structured, sort of semi-structured, if you like, or focused, and then unstructured. And it might be good to think through some of those things at the front end. And as Dr. Ferraro said, these are interviews that are taking place as part of a fatality review. They're not investigations, they're certainly not interrogations. There's a different ethic, an ethos about approaching these interviews. So they are human exchanges, and we humanize as we work through this process. So our golden rule with fatality review, or one of them at least, is to do no harm. So our interviewing style, whether it be with perpetrators or other people, would sort of evidence that philosophy. So a couple of rather important topics to consider. What kinds of compromises and difficulties did perpetrators face that shaped their lives? What were the threats to them as they grew up? And what are their current fears? It seems that perpetrators often have pretty classic profiles of traumatized individuals, rather like perhaps sometimes the people that they've killed. So we need to bear that in mind at the front end. And they often will have a strong sensitivity to threat, even although they may not present in that way. So we have to think through those things and understand perhaps how they view the world often as a threatening place and get a sense of that. And these interviews are going to tend to be, especially if they're unstructured or semi-structured, they're going to be more focused, and they're going to take the form really of life history interviews as much as they are specific inquiries about the presenting homicide or some other more incident-bound event. And as I said earlier, most perpetrators, certainly the ones that I've interviewed, have had histories of trauma over the life course. And I want to very crudely summarize a complicated research literature for the purposes of this presentation by dividing these up into sort of less severe, what we might call sort of tier 1, if you like, or level 1 trauma, where someone, many of us may be exposed to, say, a traumatic event in our childhood. If we're over 3 years old at the time, we may retain the memory, but often people overcome and are resilient in the face of traumas like that. If we move up the scale and look at more severe forms of trauma, usually we're talking here about repeated exposure to extreme external events. We might be talking about repeated sexual abuse, for example, fondling by an uncle. There often is a memory that's retained of this, and the argument here is that the trauma builds and compounds and the severity increases over time. The most severe trauma, and we often see the most severe trauma in perpetrators of domestic violence, homicides, intimate partner homicides, whether they be male or female. With the most severe trauma, we're talking really about multiple pervasive events that begin in a very young age and last for a long time. And this may entail sadistic abuse too by parents. And this has the deepest, most enduring psychological consequences. And some of the original sites here, there's a lot of literature on this. Solomon and Heidi's work, working off of Ter's original work in the psychiatric literature, defines this as sort of tier 3, level 3 trauma. So, and by trauma, we're essentially talking about the psychological trauma, or at least the effects of an event that cause intense fear. Maybe instill a sense of helplessness or horror that sort of overwhelm coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms. And we want to know about this because these forms of trauma will interfere with or affect the nature of the interview that we have with perpetrators. Now, the most severe type of trauma, type 3 trauma, often we find the child the victim of multiple perpetrators, either within the family or people who've drifted in from the outside of the family as well. They may be close relatives, and the abuse is often frequent and often unpredictable. Sometimes force is used, generally force is used, in fact, and sometimes it's sadistic. So the issue here is people close to you who you are allegedly building trusting relationships with are abusing you. The unpredictability renders life uncertain, unpredictable, and problematic. So building trust and feeling abandoned by those that you love become very important aspects of these cases. And folks who have these problems may present for treatment, feeling suicidal or hopeless, but they may not even be consciously aware of why that they feel that way. And we may encounter these situations in prison, interviewing someone who's incarcerated, who may present with maybe a depressed affect or some of these symptoms. So what does this mean for the fatality review interviewer? Well, it means that trusting people in general is a low priority, and one in some ways is naturally suspicious at a very deep level. So trusting a fatality review interviewer, even although they're not an interrogator or an investigator, is still potentially problematic. And this, as we said, is a reflection of deeper trust issues that they have and the very high abandonment anxiety they have, but also a reflection too of the difficulties they have in general getting close to other human beings. And this was perhaps reflected in their own intimate partner relationship. Abusers, batterers who kill, which is a relatively small number of them, have classic problems getting close to other human beings. So we need to bear that in mind and translate that into our interview methodology. Another thing we have to pay attention to is the fact that folks may not remember their experiences. They may be genuinely amnesic regarding specific parts of their childhood. They may have in some ways dissociated during their childhood, during abusive episodes. They may genuinely not be able to remember. They're going to be hypervigilant. They're going to be very aware, perhaps even to the level of paranoia about what's going on. And remember, we're asking questions, sometimes probing questions, about the recesses of their lives. And if there's one thing that often intimate partner homicide perpetrators are, is that they're very secretive and very shielded and guarded about who they are. They're also, in relation to that, very isolated. They're often loners. So that hypervigilance and that shielding the self off is something that we ought to be thinking about as we approach the interview. So building that rapport early on, constructing that in the interview deliberately as a strategy, is very important. Putting people at ease, attempting to do that. Now we also may add that during the interview, and this will in some ways be a product of the interview exchange and the medium that you're working in, but during that interview, interviewees may exhibit signs of dissociation, appearing as if they're not there. Their actual physical features may change, their face may change, their eyes may change. I've even been in interviews before with female perpetrators where their hair and their skin tone has changed. And these are very strange phenomena, but we may or may not see those during the interview. And of course, if the interview lasts, say, an hour that a therapist might have with a client, that's one thing. And therapists are trained to often release trauma slowly over a period of time. But in the fatality review interview, we often don't have that luxury. We may be with someone for several hours at a time. So that skilled solicitation of release of trauma over time may not be something that we are able to do as easily. So that may be a luxury that we can ill afford in these settings. Now, Solomon and Heidi and a whole bunch of other people have also listed other significant symptoms that you may be confronted with. And I don't want to just read these out, but clearly the interpersonal distrust and the anxiety, these are very important issues, as indeed are things like the impulsivity, the narcissism, and the self-injury as well. So we may be dealing with all these things when we're interviewing offenders. And another phrase for some of the things I've talked about, more sort of jargony phrase recently that came out of the work of Finkelhor et al., is polyvictimization. And here again, we're talking about multiple forms of victimization, violence by strangers, and of those people these researchers worked with, 10% suffered 7 or more types of victimization. So that's a pretty extreme level of victimization. So what we're seeing in prison populations is people who are often severely abused, what I referred to earlier as sort of type 3 or tier 3 trauma. And, these are traumas and forms of victimization that operate not just within the familial setting, but they may well operate within neighborhoods where there is sort of a war zone mentality, if you like, a lot of crime, criminality, adult criminality as well, juvenile gang activity. So all of these things might be things to know and to learn about in advance of going into those interviews. So we want to explore the emotional development of the perpetrator. So from the files that we have, we may want to know if they were diagnosed, if there were early signs of disorder in their life, whether there was medication. And sometimes this information can be very sensitive. This may be HIPAA protected information. It may not be. The family may have shared this, the offender may have shared this information. But again, we want to be careful, as Dr. Ferraro said earlier, to be aware of the differences between public, private, and confidential information when we harvest the interview for this kind of developmental information and compromises. We might want to know if someone was developmentally delayed in terms of perhaps their education. Were they held back in school? Did they work in special education settings? Were they depressed, anxious, aggressive, bullying, cruel to animals? Had they experienced PTSD, for example, prior to the homicide? We find a number of offenders. I've interviewed a number of perpetrators over the years in prison, all of them male perpetrators, who had experienced serious head injuries growing up. And that may have been linked to traumatic brain injury, to PTSD. And we're just beginning to work this research interface at the moment. But knowing about those things. So I interviewed one gentleman who'd been kicked in the head by a horse when he was 15 years old. Another who'd been hurled through the windshield of his car while he was driving drunk and was in a coma for 2 days. These are the kinds of things that we want to pay attention to. I interviewed another man just a year ago who had been involved in a drunken brawl with his father when the offender was 14 years of age. And his father had taken a piece of 2x4 and whacked him over the head with it. And basically, he'd felt himself, his legs twitching as he was loaded into the ambulance for emergency medical services. So these are the kinds of things that do affect perhaps behavior over time, and things that we want to be alert to as we move in to do the interview. Individual risk factors, such as adverse childhood experiences, things that we've been talking about, are also potentiated by poverty and economic inequality. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we need to know what's going on in the neighborhood, the poverty that the family lived in, if they did. So learning about upbringing, neighborhood, street violence, these are all very important things. Now, a significant proportion of Americans score 0 on the ACE scores, roughly a third of them. Only about 2% have scores of 5 or more. So again, this talks to those offenders at the higher end, if you like, of the pyramid, the ones who are usually extremely traumatized, who commit large amounts, disproportionate amounts of violence. Now, one book I like on these topics is James Garbarino's book. And James Garbarino's book, Listening to Killers, published by University of California Press in 2015. Garbarino there talks about his career, fabulous career, interviewing offenders. And he makes this statement, which I've always liked: most male killers are best understood as untreated, traumatized children who inhabit and control the minds, hearts, and bodies of adult men. And this very eloquent statement about offenders really reminds us that these are human beings, and that we do a respectful interview with them, and we remember, as children, they weren't always the way they turned out to be. And with intimate partner homicides in particular, this peculiar set of cases that tends to form the staple of fatality review work, whether it be in reviewing single killings, whether it be homicide-suicide reviews, which are 90% male perpetrated, or whether they be familicide reviews, there is a sense out there that male perpetrators who commit these offenses have a desire for power and domination and control. And this is one of the sort of bedrock assumptions of the domestic violence movement, embellished in the power and control wheel, for example. So an important caveat here is that we're not here to, we're here to fact find. We're not here to presume that male perpetrators act in a certain way to realize power necessarily, because it may be more complicated than that. So, often the tendency is to situate this violence within the context of the overall oppression of women in a patriarchal society. However, that kind of thinking, it may or may not be accurate, but that kind of thinking, kind of shoehorning male perpetrators into that kind of mindset and that kind of political regime, limits our maneuverability in the review. It implies even some level that there may even be a conscious plot. But when we interview folks, we find often something more complicated in that. We find the role of race and culture, sexual orientation, class. Class matters hugely in these offenses. So what we've got here at the core of some of this stuff is this strange paradox between what we might think is the power of the perpetrator and, on the other hand, is the powerlessness of the perpetrator. My understanding of this stuff is that these guys kill when they're relatively powerless and when their control is ebbing, not when they feel powerful or when they feel in control. So bearing in mind these tendencies, that we're dealing with not someone who's necessarily just physically powerful vis-a-vis the victim, but someone who is relatively vulnerable to suffers abandonment anxiety too and feels often powerless, is perhaps worth bearing in mind. So this raises questions about intent or motive or inferring tactics, that somehow abusers have made conscious choices to do things. We know that abusers can be very impulsive. We know that male abusers can be strongly misogynistic. They can think that violence is a way of solving their problems. But again, if we infer intent into their behavior, we may be jumping the gun here, because often when we talk with these folks, their understanding of what they've done may not comport precisely with what either the victim in her lifetime thought before being killed, or what other observers thought was the essence of his behavior. So we see a mix of complicated behavior. Sometimes we see clear calculation that the abuser will acknowledge in an interview, but sometimes we see more undeveloped emotional condition where folks don't quite understand necessarily what they're doing. So we may be dealing here with unconscious drives, biological forces, or even inexplicable forces, things we can't understand, sort of the haunting presence of the inexplicable in these interviews. So this is curious stuff, but again, realizing the complexity is, I think, in many ways really important. We have to remember, too, that these perpetrators are often very sensitive to rejection. They have a high sensitivity to this. So their disposition is to anxiously expect and readily perceive and often overreact to rejection. And we know often these offenders were very jealous and suspicious, sought to control their partner's actions maybe, but that sensitivity to rejection is something that we ought to be aware of as we approach folks. This is obviously linked, as we've said before, to past trauma. Their sensitivity may even legitimize their aggression, and they may see this in terms of self-preservation, their own physical safety. But they may also be guarding against what James Gilligan, in his wonderful book, Violence, refers to as psychic annihilation. And it's often the case that offenders may genuinely believe they are morally entitled to engage in defensive action, and they may believe that what they have done is justified. So it's not that we want to go in there and excuse their behavior, but it's also we want to appreciate things from their perspective. So the work of Garbarino reminds us that often folks in these situations grew up in this sort of war zone mentalities, areas of concentrated poverty. And we certainly see that in our death review work. Our death review work in some communities is going to be very different. For example, we've worked with communities in Detroit, St. Louis, where we see very concentrated poverty, historical poverty over a long period of time. And this affects the nature of the offenses, the nature of the reviews, etc. And I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Ferraro, who's going to talk about female perpetrators.
Thank you. And I want to make sure, is the sound okay for everybody now? Yes, we're okay. And, you know, if you have questions as we're going through the webinar, please type them in the Q&A box there, and we will try to respond to any questions that you have. Oh, thank you for responding to my question, too. So in terms of female perpetrators, I think that many of us are aware that a large portion, if not the vast majority, of women who kill their intimate partners have a history of victimization by those partners. And, you know, Dr. Websdale talked a lot about trauma, more from the psychological individual level, although he just mentioned the very highly impoverished communities. But for most women in prison, they are already confined by the social conditions in their communities and in their families, and by the abuse in their relationships. So while they may have had histories of trauma, they also are embedded in a context of very limited options and very difficult choices. So we don't have there's no national database of women who kill their partners, but localized studies have found between 70 and 85% of women who kill their partners have experienced prior abuse by that person, so that their action is actually generally a culmination of a long history of abusive behavior on the part of their victim. But not all victims who have experienced prior violence are acting in self-defense at the time of the homicide. So there are many cases in which there's bidirectional violence in the relationship, and I certainly am aware of the controversy about bidirectional violence, and the argument that most of women's violence that's called bidirectional was actually self-defensive. But in interviewing many women over the last 40 years, a number of them have talked about their own directive violence, initiated violence that was fully equivalent to what their partner dished out to them. And so even though they had experienced abuse by their partner, that they were also very much involved in physical and emotional violence toward their partner and controlling behavior. Another factor for women who kill their partners is often severe financial problems. So there may have been a history of abuse by the victim toward the female perpetrator, but that's not the catalyst for the homicide. The catalyst is a growing awareness of the impact of the financial difficulties on the couple. In some cases, it's an act of revenge. They're very angry and upset with what their partner has done. There are cases where they're aware of child sexual abuse for their children, and they decide to deal with that on their own. Or it may be a matter of jealousy for a new partner. They may have a new partner themselves, and in some cases we know that women are able to gather the courage to end an abusive relationship when they establish a relationship with someone who's not abusive and is kind and loving toward them. But in some cases, those new partners feel, along with the woman, that their lives would be better without the abusive partner, and so there's a collusion to get rid of that person. And that's also true with third-party murders, when a woman is involved with someone else who kills her abusive partner. In the cases that I've reviewed that involve the third party, often those third parties are also very abusive men who kind of move beyond the control of the woman, and nevertheless she's implicated in the homicide because she can't control that person. But it's not a matter of self-defense. And then certainly there are cases of mental illness where the woman is suffering from a psychosis, where she may misperceive what's occurring and view her partner as a kind of an imminent threat, even though that's not the case to an objective observer. And of course that can be exacerbated by the person's involvement in drugs and alcohol. And then, so there's that other 20% of victims who kill their, of women who kill their partners who are not victims. They have not experienced prior abuse. And I've certainly interviewed female perpetrators who don't claim that there was any prior abuse. They don't believe that that's what was going on. Or they may argue that there was abuse, but there's contradictory evidence about that from other sources suggesting that's not the case. Or in many cases, there's no corroborating evidence because it was never reported, it was never confirmed. And in some cases, there's evidence that there actually was not abuse. For example, there's a person who claimed that her partner that she murdered had broken her shoulder, and then the hospital records indicated that that was not the case. That was a result of another kind of accident. Now, of course, this is very complicated because we know often victims will fabricate explanations for injuries that were inflicted by their partner because they're not ready to report that partner. So, as Dr. Websdale said, these are very complicated stories, and sometimes it's very difficult to determine which aspects of the story are reliable and which aspects are kind of fabrication after the fact. And again, most of the women who kill have a lifetime of polyvictimization, similar to the male perpetrators. And because of that lifetime of polyvictimization, they do have a low level of threat perception and a sense that no one will help them and they can't trust anyone. And that's often the context in which they perceive that their only option is to kill their abusive partner. But if it doesn't occur within a context that our criminal justice system recognizes as one of self-defense, even self-defense recognizing the history of victimization, then they're going to be prosecuted for maybe manslaughter, but also homicide. So whether you're interviewing a man or a woman perpetrator, some of the things that you want to explore with them to help you understand better what happened with this relationship is, how did you two meet? And what we find in many of these cases is that it conforms to what the general domestic violence literature discusses, is there's a very fast entry into the romantic relationship. They know each other for a very short time and move in together and begin a serious, intimate relationship. Ask them to recall what the relationship was like in the beginning. So for most people, even in severe domestic violence situations, the initial aspects of the relationship was very compelling. They feel like it's a soulmate. It's the one person in the world that understands them, and they become very close very quickly. And often in these situations, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, they become quite isolated from other relationships, and so this relationship takes on a huge importance in their identity and the meaning of their life, so that threats to that relationship become a threat to their very existence. You want to explore the children, whether they had children together, at what point they had children, and how that affected their relationship. And of course, whether their children came to the relationship from other fathers, other mothers, and then how they felt about those kids. And we know that the presence of stepchildren is a risk marker, both for the kids and for generally the female in that relationship, because those kids are a reminder of previous relationships and pose a threat to the abusive partner. What other kinds of challenges did the couple face? Were they dealing with any illnesses? That's often a component of these relationships. Accidents, so the only vehicle they had is destroyed, or there's a physical injury resulting in unemployment. Generally, there's a pretty significant financial difficulties, and often substance abuse, either alcohol or illegal drugs, sometimes prescription drugs, sometimes everything that's mind-altering and can exacerbate violence in the relationship. Try to understand where their position was in the community. Were they part of any organized religion? Did they participate in faith-based services? What was their extended family like? Did they have people that they could talk to? Did they have people who supported them, or was it mostly criticism and rejection? Did they have friends they could rely on? Who was part of their circle? And did they seek any services? As Dr. Websdale mentioned, because many of them suffer from mental health issues, did they ever obtain counseling? Was it helpful? If not, why not? Many abusive people who wind up committing homicide have been through a batterer intervention program, find out if they had done that, what was the outcome of it, what did they think about it, and then what other kinds of resources did they attempt to access, and were they available, were they helpful, and what would have been more helpful to them to somehow stop the train of violence. So then also we know that there are definitely changes in the relationship, at least in the perception of perpetrators prior to a homicide. So what were the factors that led to that homicide? Often there's a perception of a new partner, a sexual infidelity, and it may be an imagined infidelity, it may be an actual infidelity, but that raises the specter of loss of control and loss of intimacy with that person, and sometimes the catalyst. A very typical and frequent issue is the partner has either told them that they're going to leave or has left the relationship, and the control that was central to that abusive relationship is threatened or is completely pulled out from under their feet, and that's the catalyst. And again, did they have a growing financial problems? Did they have problems that increased in severity? Would the partner that they killed would taunt them or ridicule them? And we know that this certainly doesn't ever excuse what happened. None of these things are excuses for homicide, and we never want to communicate that. But what we're trying to do is figure out what caused it and what can we do to prevent it from happening to somebody else. Also explore the use of substances, of course, at the time.
Thanks. So one of the phenomena that we've both wrestled with over the years is this issue of memory impairment. And, you know, there's a pretty extensive criminological psychiatric literature on this. That, you know, if you look at violent offenders in general, roughly 1/4 to 4/10 of them claim amnesia. And as James Gilligan says, you know, one can never really know for certain what's going on or has gone on in another person's mind. Now, the possibility that someone is, for example, a male perpetrator of intimate partner homicide, the possibility that someone is trying to excuse or rationalize or justify their own behavior is a common phenomenon, minimizing the impact, for example, of their violence. But we also see sort of what the psychiatrists sometimes refer to as malingering or deliberate faking. They may want to absolve themselves of responsibility, guilt. It may provide an excuse for them not to discuss the crime. That's a possibility. And this kind of faking may be more common when we're talking about violent and sexual crimes, particularly if there are strong shaming elements in those crimes. Often that memory impairment and that faking is associated with lower IQ, personality disorders, poor executive functioning, but it may not be. It may also be a product of sociopathy or antisocial personality disorder. In other words, there's a guile to this that is quite alarming. And there are scales here. You can see the Sims scale here to assess malingering. I'm not suggesting that you do that for a second, but clearly the issue of malingering and faking is something you're going to have to wrestle with in the interview. This is why, as Dr. Ferraro said earlier, knowing the files well and being able to communicate that you know the files in the case well is really helpful, because it may, if there's a conscious, deliberate faking, it may minimize that. There is an ongoing debate about the prevalence of genuine amnesia. We just don't know exactly what that looks like. Genuine amnesia may be up to 1/3 of cases, but again, I'm just sort of hazarding a guess from reading the literature. Another issue we have to deal with in these interviews is intrusive memories of perpetrators. And these memories can be memories that are very disturbing, and they can be akin to memories experienced by victims. They may be involuntarily triggered. They may be characterized by a low level of control and a high level of distress. So in other words, if you go there in the interview, you may elicit this kind of behavior. You may also disturb to the point of creating ruminations at some later date, which raises some ethical questions. Those ruminations may occur even during the interview. So these are intrusive memories. They're potentially challenging. They may be linked to PTSD. And the interview may feed those tendencies. In other words, it may re-traumatize, and this may be something that you might want to talk with folks about. And this is sometimes used as a reason for some fatality reviewers not to interview family members. Although, in my experience, they've been to hell and back, so we really can't use this as a reason not to interview. The act of killing a family member is obviously traumatizing, and this goes, remember, for perpetrators often as it does for victims. I've met perpetrators over the years who claim to have dissociated during the killing or appear to have exhibited dissociative behavior while they're being interviewed by investigators, for example, or interrogated. So these are complicated issues that you will revisit potentially during the course of the interview. So it's especially important, given what I've just said, to establish rapport, to understand that history of vulnerability, that sense of abandonment, that sensitivity to rejection, and to explore some of those developmental origins, but to do it softly, gradually, over time. So any trauma that unfolds in the interview unfolds slowly over time, if that's possible. So you might want to know about their bullying, if they bullied or were bullied as youth. Did they experience parental death or loss? Many male perpetrators of intimate partner homicide have felt abandoned by their mothers and or blamed their mothers for their father's retreat from the family. In fact, I just reviewed a case last week where this was a phenomenon in the case. So we want to know about the early childhood of offenders because it may give us a clue to their adult misogynism. So these are important questions. Paranoia is another one. And again, we link it to their biographies. Abusers or perpetrators may genuinely perceive a threat to themselves, and they may link that back directly to the homicide. So it's important that we don't convey a sense of threat to offenders because they may have lived threat for a long time and it's part of who they are. So it may also, that threatening lifestyle, the traumas they've experienced may have contributed to their own interpretation of their partner's behavior that we see implicated in the eventual killing. So imagined affairs, conviction she was trying to hurt him, belief she was planning to leave even if she wasn't, belief she was colluding with others. Remember, being paranoid is an uncomfortable place to be. And if the offender's paranoid, it makes them uncomfortable in the interview. So it's incumbent upon us to try to the extent possible to put them at ease. So we want to know, from the offender, other insights into the case. For example, what obstacles confronted them in their lives? How did they move towards the act of killing? And this is important to bear in mind because we tend to think that if someone's impulsive and they kill, that they couldn't have been planning, that those two things are mutually exclusive. And again, I found that it's much more complicated than that. What about the system? Perpetrators can give us good insights into the system and the way the system does or does not work. So how could the system have done a better job, or who could have intervened with the offender or elsewhere? What would have helped them? An open-ended question. What would they tell someone struggling with a tough relationship issue? So these are some of the questions, and we'll segue now into Dr. Ferraro's conversation.
Right, thanks. So a lot of states have expanded their fatality review statutes to allow teams to also review near-death cases. And these provide tremendous opportunities for gaining information because you're able to talk to the survivor directly in many cases. And a lot of times the dynamics in these relationships are going to be exactly the same as those that resulted in fatalities, and the differences that they didn't use as lethal of a weapon, or there was medical intervention successfully, and that was the only difference. It wasn't a matter of intent or level of violence occurring. So the survivors can definitely provide us with critical details, particularly about very private aspects of their lives that we're not able to obtain from people who are no longer alive. So if you're going to be doing interviews with survivors of near lethal assaults, they of course have the same requirements that the case has to be concluded and that everything is confidential, that's not public information. Because again, you're going to learn things from the victim here that is going to constitute very confidential information, not part of the public record. So a key value in interviewing survivors is that it allows you to explore their perception of the resources available to them, why they did or did not access them, and how useful they were to them. Such as, we find that less than 8% of victims of homicide have actually been in a domestic violence shelter. But of those who have, what was their experience? Why did that not prevent this near lethal assault? Same with orders of protection. Did you have one? How did it work? Did you drop it? Why? What were your feelings about the effectiveness of an order of protection? And then what was your experience with the emergency personnel who assisted you, and how can we improve on those things? I didn't want to leave that one before talking about the one case where we were able to interview a survivor, and we got a completely, entirely different picture, like the men with the elephant. Depending on whether we interviewed the survivor, we were able to interview the survivor, the perpetrator, and their adult son and adult daughter, and every person that we interviewed gave a 180-degree different picture of what was going on in that family. So it was really interesting, really helpful, and that information we use in reviews with lethalities, because we know that the image that we get of the family and the problems facing the family is going to depend on the perspective of the person we're talking to, and often those will be kind of opposite perspectives on the story. Is very, very interesting and helpful to gain that information. In interviewing family members, many of the surviving family members from intimate partner homicides feel that a review is absolutely required to involve family members in the process. This is a quote from the Pemberton report in England. Frank Mullane was the head of this, and a survivor of an intimate partner homicide of his sister. It's absolutely important at the earliest opportunity and at all stages to ensure that the family has an opportunity to contribute their perspective. So again, because there's often minimal contact with agencies, especially on the part of the victim, often there's some criminal history for the offender, less information available on the victim, so that the family can provide that. And the people that know the most, obviously, about the victim and the perpetrator are the family members. And again, it's the family members themselves who've agitated for their ability to contribute to the fatality review. Now, that doesn't mean everybody wants to. There's definitely family members who just want to move on. They don't want to talk about it, and they'd rather not be involved. But that's their choice. It should be up to the family. And a lot of family members who participate experience a catharsis as a result of doing this, sharing their story with people who truly care and truly want to use their horrible experience as a way to make things better in the future. You have to let the family know that there's definitely limits with their involvement, and that a lot of the information is confidential, that and you can't share everything with them. And then you also want to include people who are close to the perpetrator who might want to contribute information to the review. And I strongly recommend taking a look at the Montana Death Review initiative that's available on the NDVFRI website. It's a 20-minute film, and included in that film is Sarah Mosier, who was the stepmother of the perpetrator in the case that's discussed in that film. And she had received criticism for being the mother of a monster. He had killed a woman and her 2 children. And she felt, and she explains this eloquently in the film, such respect from the psychologist that conducted the interview. She spoke to her for 3 hours, explaining, that the murderer wasn't always a monster. He was a little boy, and he was a person with great value and great meaning to their family. And so she provided a lot of insights from his life. So that's an important 20-minute film that will provide a lot of information, not just on interviewing family members. So here's some suggestions too from a mother surviving the murder of her daughter, is that they're all different, and as I said, not everyone wants to participate, but many do, and at different levels. The most important thing is just to listen to the story respectfully. You may have specific information that you're after, but the most value will come from allowing the person to tell their story and to listen respectfully. Again, the history of the person's relationship with the system is probably going to set the tone for how they perceive the fatality review team. So people have different experiences, some not so nice, and others very positive. So you have to probably get some information about that background, how they were notified of the death, and what their relationship has been with the criminal justice system. So they don't like to feel like you're keeping things from them. Clearly there's some things you can't share, but as much information as is shareable should be shared with the family. Try to explore what the relationship was like with the survivor at the time, with the victim at the time of the homicide. And if there's victim blaming occurring, the media sometimes portrays the victim almost as responsible for what happened by going back to the abuser or being involved in substance abuse or a crime of some type. And so you want to assist the family in dealing with kind of media blame, because of course what the fatality review team is trying to do is cause no harm and remedy harm if it's occurring. And there may be quite a high degree of animosity between different family members, so you want to make sure that you're either interviewing family members who are on the same page, or if not, that they are interviewed separately, and then get back to them. They want to know what the team has learned from the review process and what might change as a result of the review. There are some sample outreach letters to families that are available in the Anchorage, Alaska reports, Baltimore, Maryland, and Georgia, and those are also on the NDVFRI website. But you don't want to ever convey the impression of just using a form letter or just a standardized form of communication, because these are people and they're dealing with a tragedy, so you want to make sure that it's a warm and simple human contact. And I know a lot of people are a little hesitant to try to bring the memories back of something so horrible as the loss of a family member. But as Dr. Websdale said, they've been to hell and back. And what most family members tell us is we've been through the worst. There's nothing you can ask us or say to us that's going to be, feel anywhere like what we've been through. And this is a quote from Shirley Bostrom, who lost her daughter. Survivors are not weak, fragile people. Defeated, they're strong and courageous, and they want to do everything they can to give meaning to their murdered loved one's life and death. And so participation in the review often is very important. Other collateral interviews you might consider doing with friends, neighbors, and other people can add details that other people wouldn't know about. They can produce contradictory accounts of the victim and or the perpetrator that no one has articulated. And you might consider contacting agencies that are not domestic violence or criminal justice agencies. For example, we got some really great information from a literacy program about a child who was also killed along with her mother. Clearly, the same rules of confidentiality apply, but you can use the snowball technique. And in these interviews, say, can you think of anyone else that we might talk to who would be helpful?
So, just to try to bring things to a close, I know we're running short of time, but what we're trying to set up here is a respectful interview, whether we're interviewing perpetrators, near-death survivors, family members, friends, neighbors, even agency personnel. It's really important to recognize what they've been through. Even with agency personnel they attend a review, it's important to acknowledge their loss too. Agencies lose people. Victim advocates lose people who they work with. Police officers lose people. So acknowledging that is important. So we want to explain to people who we're interviewing that we know the case, but that they have something of great value. Our goal here is understanding, not fact-finding so much. We want to build rapport. We're not there to judge people. We want to express our gratitude. We want to make eye contact. These are just simple rules of human engagement that, we want to show attentiveness with our gestures. We want to show that we understand. And we want to get inside their story. So we want to acknowledge their losses. Pacing and probing are important issues in these interviews. For perpetrators, questions like, tell me about yourself, and for others, tell me about the victim or the perpetrator. Sometimes asking open-ended questions really does open up a rich vein of information. We don't expect people to give us the story in a linear way. We want them to tell their story. We want to remain silent sometimes, and of course, to be patient. If folks drift far afield, we can gently guide them back in. We want to encourage elaboration. So following leads, tell me about that. Give me an example. If somebody says to you, and you know that from the file that they've been, as I put it earlier, to hell and back, if they tell you in a pat, simple kind of way, oh, my childhood was great, was sort of hunky-dory, you might want to be quizzical about that, and you might want to ask further questions. You want to recognize, as I said, people's pain and their fears, their own stories. And you want to also let them know that you know that it's difficult having these conversations, that it hurts to remember these memories, these events. Priming folks to this reality is important and courteous. So the interview will be better, I think, if you really want to listen. And we want to bring these interviews to a close. And again, reflecting on what we've done, we've been through someone's life, and we visited a lot of ugly stuff sometimes. So we don't want to close the interview out necessarily on a negative note. We want to recognize when things are drawing to a close, and we'll feel that naturally. We may have come to the end of our questions, or we may sense from the interviewee that their time is up, so to speak. So we want to return to the reasons that we did the interview in the first place. We want to thank people for their contributions, and we want to end on somewhat of a hopeful note that this may contribute to understanding more about these cases, helping us, for example, plan for safety better for victims, to help us to intervene with perpetrators better, etc. We want to bring the information back to the team. And very, very importantly, If we can't record the interview for whatever reason, we might want to write down our impressions or talk into a recorder. I remember doing a 4-hour interview in a prison with a familicide offender. This was in California, and I couldn't record because the prison authorities wouldn't let me take a tape in. So I actually left my tape in the car, and I went out after the interview and just talked into the tape for a very long time. And then we want to take the interview information back to the team, and it's really important here that we take the information back that the interviewee has given us, rather than our interpretation of what the interviewee has told us. We don't want to put the filter on at the level of ourselves or maybe one or two other people who've been in the interview. We want the team, because they have a greater range of expertise, to help us do that. There may be follow-up questions that we'll need to ask, other things that we need to seek information about. We want to incorporate this information into our recommendations and reports, but we want, very importantly, to be cognizant of confidentiality guarantees. And it's very easy to leak very sensitive, hurtful information into reports without knowing that we're doing it. So on that note, I'll close, and perhaps Kathleen and I can take some questions. Our contact information is up on the screen, and we'll see. I don't know if we have any questions, but Dr. Ferraro, do you see any? Your eyesight's better than mine.
I can't see any questions. Would the questions be visible in the Q&A box? Okay, it looks like we don't have questions.
They're just coming through here on the screen. There are comments, but no questions at this point. Okay. Oh, so one question: how do you ensure confidentiality when conducting a review in the community? Let me take a stab at that, and maybe
Sure.
Dr. Ferraro, you
Sure.
could add
Go
to it.
ahead.
You know, when you're doing a review in the community, the review team is operating in executive session in a community facility. So usually nearly all states have confidentiality statutes. So the deliberations of the review team, once they go into executive session, will be confidential, private information. So everybody signs a confidentiality agreement. There's usually a statute with civil penalties attached to divulging information. So well, I suppose anybody could go into a review and blurt out private information or confidential information. There's no way to absolutely guarantee that. This tends obviously not to happen. We make absolutely sure that we filter information into the review team, so review teams don't read protected information unless there's some kind of exemption in their statute. So we're very, very careful to do that. Dr. Ferraro, is there anything else in terms of confidentiality? Most of it's governed by the statute.
Yeah, so I was thinking maybe your question was too about how you assure confidentiality when you're doing interviews in the community as well. And so we just tell people that whatever they share with us will not be publicized, will not be made public unless it's already public information. So, you know, sometimes there's a very sensitive information about sexual abuse of the victim, or sexual activity on the part of the victim that isn't public information, but it helps us understand her context. So we just assure people that's not something that will be in the report. It just will help us frame our recommendations and our understanding of the case.
The next question here is, we're seeing an increase in perpetrator suicides in the Denver metro area, most recently this past weekend. Would you modify any of your suggestions in these kinds of cases. In terms of reviewing homicides, suicides, if that's where the question is going.
I think she's saying only the perpetrator kills themselves, not
Oh,
not the victim.
oh, I see. If the perpetrator kills themselves and it's deemed reviewable by the team, then obviously the approach is going to be a little different. You're touching a nerve here because we're very interested in both perpetrator and victim suicide. It's a huge, I mean, these are tip of the iceberg cases, but we suspect, we lose more victims to suicide than we do to homicide, exiting violent controlling relationships. But I don't know that our interview methodologies would be any different. We may be more cognizant and pursue the issue of depression, things like that. Dr. Ferraro?
Hi Dorley, we did actually do a review of a suicide only last year, and I wouldn't change any of the recommendations, but there you have the victim still with you. So as in the near-death cases, you're going to have an opportunity to learn from the victim a lot more about kind of what resources were available and then kind of what the relationship was like right prior to the suicide. And I think that that's extremely valuable information, and we learned a lot from doing that review. So yeah, I think those are great cases to pursue for fatality review.
Yeah, and if I just may jump in there, one of the things that we're doing nationally is we're building a clearinghouse to receive data from teams, de-identified data from teams, so that we can begin to build more of a national picture about these different types of offences. And the interview work that we do is critical to that. So if there are teams out there who are interested in participating in this national clearinghouse, you can just shoot us an email, myself or Kathleen, because we are in the process of identifying those folks at this moment. So I don't know if we have any questions, any further questions. I think we're...
That's all the questions. I want to thank everybody for being on the webinar today, and also appreciate all the work you do on your fatality review teams in your community. And do visit our webpage. There's a ton of resources on there. Some of you have contributed to that, so thank you.
And I would like to add to that and just say that just glancing down the names here, there are a lot of folks that I know on the call, so it's lovely to see your names up in lights, and thanks for all the great work you and the rest of the call-in people do. And thanks very much indeed for listening.